my dad never understood that. He was a die-hard Calvinist, 5-pointer. If there were a 10-point Calvinist, he would have been one. He was a hyper-Calvinist, actually. And he said, if you're a believer and the Holy Spirit's worked in your heart, you're going to be 100% certain. I was like, Dad, I'm not 100% certain about anything. In fact, it's hard for me to make decisions at times over stupid things like what cologne to purchase, years ago, or what watch to buy, or some, things like that, so.
I don't shop with Mike.
Yeah, she won't. She doesn't like to shop with me, and I can understand why. But it's just the way we're wired, and but my dad couldn't understand that. In fact, a few years before both my parents died, he canceled a Christmas trip. One time he asked me several years ago. I was telling him about doubts, and he said, "Well, how sure are you Christianity's true?" I said, "Well, about 80%, 80%." And it's like he just couldn't. He got mad at me for that, and it just stewed in him for several years. We didn't talk about it for several years, but we invited him to visit us in the Atlanta area for Christmas, and they originally agreed, and then he canceled it because he was so upset that a few years before that I'd said I was only 80% certain Christianity was true. And a little more now, of course, but I was struggling with doubts at that point.
A little more now. So maybe 85%. Sure. So I've taken up most of the hour. I'm going to have to go over just a little bit here. But how do you deal with someone who says, I'm a Christian, but I'm only about 80% sure that Christianity is true? Or maybe a little bit more now, maybe 85. How do you approach someone like this? Well, first of all, there's a number of things here. There is a vast difference between talking about rational categories of not assurance, but of certainty, and the spiritual quality of assurance of one's relationship to God. Obviously, no one, Dr. Licona, myself, no one has ever faced every question that could ever be asked of the Christian faith. And there are questions I've never pondered, objections I've never seen. Those of us who work in the field of apologetics have seen many more objections than the vast majority of regular believers will see in their life. But that doesn't mean we've seen all of them. And so, on a purely naturalistic, rationalistic level, leaving the spiritual aside, when you push that aspect of things out of the way, the role of the Holy Spirit, just looking at rational argumentation, you end up limiting each one of us as to how much knowledge we can have. And since none of us have all knowledge, none of us can be absolutely certain about anything. And that's the problem that many of us have living in this day and age, is that all the people around us have a worldview where they are at the center. Every aspect of knowledge, they have to coordinate with every other aspect of knowledge. And God, religion, history, those are all simply viewed as things that we have to somehow coordinate together. We're in the center. And any honest person knows, I don't know that much. The more you learn, the more you realize how little you actually know. That's something old people say because it's true. The amount of human knowledge is minuscule in comparison to God, but it's vast in comparison to me. And anyone who doesn't realize that is a fool. They may think they're very wise. They're a sophomore. They're a wise fool. That's what being a sophomore is. And so if you approach it from that perspective, and most people are approaching it from that perspective, that's the only way you can put a number on something. is that you're saying, well, I'm assigning a certain value, and, from what I've seen, I'm 80%, 85% convinced. Now, I think that there is, on a pastoral level, a really good reason for apologetics to be done within the church, because I would simply say, from a pastoral perspective, that if you're only 85% sure, you probably shouldn't be involved with apologetics. Just that, I can't see how that's your calling. If that's where you are, I don't get that. And you see, if apologetics was done in the church, and especially done by elders who are to be gifted to have the ability to do the things they've been called to do, then that's totally different than how we handle these things, where, again, most apologists just do whatever they want to do. And they go wherever they want to go. They're not really ministers in the church, associated with the church. That's one of the major problems. So I would say on that level, if your struggles with doubts are at that level, maybe this isn't the area you should be working in. But I think that this opens the door, and again, we could spend another hour literally on this, and I'm not going to spend another hour. I just want to throw these things out there for your consideration. I think we could spend another hour talking about what it means to have assurance, yes, on the subjective level, the role of the Holy Spirit of God. All of that is a vitally important area. But what I want to focus on is the fact that I think you see here a fundamental difference between the kind of minimal facts apologetics that Michael Licona practices, along with many other people, the kind of minimal facts approach and what it results in, and a much fuller biblical form of apologetics, an apostolic form of apologetics. Oh, I just can't believe you'd say something like that. Look, these two forms of I've been criticizing this form of apologetics for a long time. You can go back in the archives, and I've played I don't know how many debates between Bart Ehrman and Michael Licona from the first time they started, from the time he did the croaking debate, where he had no voice. And I think pretty much everyone since then, we've played them and we've interacted with them. Yeah, we focused upon Ehrman, but we've also had to focus upon Licona, because Licona said a lot of things in those debates were like, no, that's not how you respond to this. There's compromise here. This is not the way to do it. And I will not apologize for contrasting methods of apologetics. This is important stuff. And so it just seems to me that when your argumentation is based upon the preponderance of the evidence pointing to the greater probability of the existence of a God, that has an impact upon the individual utilizing that kind of argumentation. In other words, as I've said all along, your theology is supposed to determine your apologetics. If your apologetics ends up determining your theology, and your apologetics is primarily based upon get the best percentage you can, what's your theology going to look like? It's going to be get the best percentage you can. So, hey, 85 is pretty good. But that's the difference. That's the difference between the minimalist facts approach and how the apostles approach it, and how they absolutely emphasize the centrality of Jesus Christ and the reality that outside of the existence of the triune God, you can't explain having a debate on the existence of God or anything else. That the epistemology that puts man in the center and allows man to be the one to then coordinate all the areas of knowledge must collapse upon itself, because man can never be there. The epistemology that underlies a meaningful apologetic approach where God is in the center and you start with him, and hence can provide a devastating internal critique of any other worldview, and show the consistency of your own, that doesn't leave you with percentages. That actually leaves you with certainties. Now, there is as someone said on Facebook today in response to this, there is a supra-rational, not irrational. That's irrational and supra-rational, not the same thing. There is a level of knowledge of truth that goes beyond merely the human plane. And in there you can talk about the witness of the Holy Spirit, but there is also where you find these overarching realities of the consistency of worldviews. And I think a lot of folks who would hear what Dr. Licona says don't see or are not willing to see that on the level he's talking about, they don't have any more certainty than he does. They may pretend they do, but the fact is he's heard a lot more objections than the vast majority of the people who are going to laugh at his 80, 85 number. But they're actually just simply ignoring that reality. They're criticizing without knowing what the questions are. I don't think that's where we need to go. I think what we need to see this as is an illustration of something more foundational, more basic in regards to what kind of apologetics is most consistent with the biblical revelation of the universe as God created it. If God created the universe and defines all things, then no worldview that starts with him anywhere else but in the center is ever going to be able to reason its way out of a paper bag. It's not going to be able to give us a sound foundation for anything else. And it just seems to me that the argumentation that I've heard him using in theology, because there's clearly he doesn't have a warm spot in his heart for Reformed theology. Now, you might argue that's because he ran into people who were bad Calvinists. Maybe his dad was a bad Calvinist. I don't know. Your experience with someone can have great impact upon you, but it's not going to be an excuse for believing sub-biblical theology. There are a lot of Calvinists who are jerks. But if you can't tell the difference between the theology and the person who doesn't live consistently with the theology, that's going to be to your detriment. So that kind of, I met somebody, I've met all sorts of people who've been mean and nasty to me from other perspectives. That we can't allow that to become the lens through which we view everything else. There clearly is a prejudice against Reformed theology. But that Reformed theology is central, I think, to what you just heard. I think that's why you have the 80, 85%, is because the very grounding of the kind of certainty we can have, that super-rational certainty, not the I've heard every objection and haven't answered every objection type of certainty, not the naturalistic, rationalistic type, but the consistent worldview type. The worldview that makes sense of all of man's knowledge, even if you don't have all of it. God's big enough to handle all of man's knowledge because he knows a lot more than man does. That's why this stuff's important. This is apologetics and theology, but they join. You can't separate them. You can't keep them separated. And a lot of people do that. They have that over here, and they've compartmentalized this here, there, and everywhere. And that's a problem.